There are few things that people like more than making assumptions about what kind of a person they are based on what they wear, and that also includes the watch that they have on their wrist. Rolex owners are fools and posers and sheep. Patek owners are rich, mindless drones. Cubitus haters are poor and they're not Patek customers. Tudor, they are people that can't afford Rolex watches. And Hublot, it's just footballers. There are also positive ankles, but it's those often negative stereotypes that get a laugh, so those are the ones we latch onto. But really, what does a watch say about you? Well, I want to dive into that question, but not in the way that everyone else has. I want to look at it from the perspective of the brands. How do they view us? How does it inform their business decisions, the products they make, the way they communicate with us, and what it says about us as watch enthusiasts? Let's dive in. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of those perspectives of the brands, I thought it would be relevant to just talk briefly about why I don't do the usual what your watch says about you discussion. There's this theory or tool called Johari's window, which is used in communications, which illustrates these blind spots and assumptions that affect how we process information. When it comes down to what a watch says about someone, you're just generally not operating on an objective assessment of some other individual based on your complete knowledge of them as an individual. You're aggregating that little bit that you do know about the individual, plus your own assumptions about that individual, which are completely fill-in-the-blanks assumptions. And you're adding your own perception of the watch and your own perception of the brand and your own experiences with other people you've met or haven't met who have that kind of watch. At best, your conclusion is going to be incomplete. The reality is, on a specific level, an assessment of an individual, it's going to be based on flawed and incomplete information, and it's going to be more about you and yourself and less about the person that you're assessing. Secondly, I just don't think it's useful at a personal level. Stereotyping is human nature. I do it myself. It makes it easier for us to operate. But when it comes down to human interaction on a one-on-one basis, I think it's best to try and be a little bit more open. And judging a person on whatever watch they wear is just not a particularly good measure of a person's personality, values, or character. So you're a brand and you want to sell your watches. A lot of independent watches start with a dream that is partially about making money, but also a labor of creative expression. You've got a watch design that you're proud of, and you're hoping that somebody else out there is going to like it too. For small independents, there may have been some market research, but there's often more of a hunch to these things. But overall, you do have to go through a couple of steps to figure out whether or not there are customers for your watch and what your typical customer looks like. This is where the product people, the marketing people, and maybe a psychologist or two get into the room. The thing they want to get to ultimately is a number of archetypes or stereotypes of customers that they can craft a product and a message to that will resonate. Think of it this way. There's a market for watches in general. Then as a subset, there's a market for your kind of watches. That subset is going to have some general characteristics. In that subset, there's likely going to be a number of meaningful, larger or smaller subsets of customers that are a bit more distinct. Ideally, you want a subset at the end of the day that is big enough to encompass a large enough market for you, but distinct enough to have a specific customer segment that you can target. The most sophisticated brands likely have a very clear understanding about what their customers look like. They understand where they live, which cars they're likely to drive, their income levels, their education, potentially their political views, and a whole lot more. Each company likely does this all a little bit differently. There are a lot of ways to talk about this, but I want to boil it down to 3 simple dimensions which I think guide a lot of companies' decisions. It's down to information, interest, and differentiation. To understand the concept of information, I'm going to start with the big daddy, Rolex. And what can we conclude about Rolex? We know they are perceived as generally high quality mass-produced watches. We know that Rolex itself is associated with wealth, success, status for a lot of people. We know that they are not seen as particularly innovative or risk-taking. They rarely make big changes to lineups. Their watches are typically changed in minute ways over long periods of time. They are also, relatively speaking, quite expensive. What of those 4 things we know are the key driver of Rolex's customer perspective? It's number 2. Rolex is associated with wealth, success, and status. Quality is secondary. Quality is there to support the argument that this is a status product, because rich people don't buy crap. Also, rich people are willing to buy expensive things if they are good quality and they convey a certain level of status either to others or to themselves. And change, rich people tend to be more conservative. All research points to this. Wealthier people are more likely to take a less risky approach, and to them, small iterations convey stability and quality and security where massive changes unsettle them. The core is that status thing. Which brings us to a key archetype and the concept of information. What's lacking in most Rolex's communications? They don't really talk that much about specifications. They don't go into detail about how something is made. To be clear, they say that their products are really well made and they say they do it all themselves. But have they ever really opened their doors? No, not really. They just say they have a superlative chronometer. They don't look to some external certification like METAS. They just say our watches are good. That's the common theme. It's low information. Our watches are good. People with good taste will like them. You won't be disappointed. That's it. I'm going to apologize for me stereotyping now. After all, I said I wouldn't, but what's the common question you get from a first-time Rolex buyer? Is it a good watch? That, and can you get me a spot on the waiting list? But the first question says a lot. Rarely are the buyers looking for a detailed explanation. This is a group that just wants you to say, yes, it's a good watch. This is a group that asks you because you're a watch nerd, so they'll trust you if you say yes. This isn't because they're idiots. This is not because they're sheep. It's because they literally have some things in their lives that they spend a lot of time deciding on, and on other things they optimize by simplifying other decisions. Someone answering, yes, that Rolex is a pretty good watch, is all they need to know. Someone telling them that they're overpriced compared to the manufacturing costs is not something that's lost on them, but it's not important because they've already made up their minds that $9,000 for a sub is a reasonable price for them. From Rolex's perspective, they've clearly crafted a message that speaks to a group of people that want something that is easily confirmed as good, and Rolex does that in spades. The Rolex branding conveys this. You rarely, if ever, hear anyone say a Rolex is badly made. Sure, some of you will say it's expensive for what you get, but you will in most cases accept that it's a really well-made, mass-produced watch. At the core, Rolex crafts its message for low levels of information. Simple, undetailed messages that signal that this is a good watch. Contrast this with Jaeger LeCoultre. Their entry watches are around $8,000 or $9,000. It's a little bit more expensive than Rolex, but a Polaris Geographic will set you back about the same as a Daytona. Their gold watches are all in the ballpark of gold Rolexes, at least when they're not complicated. Go to Jaeger LeCoultre's website. What do you meet? You meet talk about the complexity of enameling. You meet information about hand polishing and the number of hours it takes to polish a base plate or engrave a caseback. Their most notable watches are by definition complicated. They're intricate. The way they present their products and their universe is with high information. I do honestly believe they see far more of their customers as high information customers, where a vast majority of Rolex customers are likely low information when it comes to watches. JLC have customers that want more information. They want the reverso story about Polo. They want the history behind how Jaeger LeCoultre used to make movements for Patek and AP. On a surface level, they're doing the same as Rolex, saying our watches are good, but they're doing it in a much, much more detailed and elaborate way. That's because they believe that's what a typical Jaeger LeCoultre buyer wants. More of them want to understand more about the creative process that goes into enameling. More of them take an interest into the engineering behind a Memovox complication or a geographic complication. The perpetual calendar, which very much is a JLC thing, is geared entirely towards interest. There's no objective need for something that will tell the date accurately for the next 400 years. You have to seek out information on why that's cool, and that's something that speaks to a certain kind of buyer. JLC is crafting their brand towards high information customers. And this is where I add the second dimension, interest. For Jaeger LeCoultre, they are delivering more information, but the information is also crafted towards a person that has a clear interest in watches. You to some extent have to care a little bit about watches and watchmaking to want to buy a perpetual calendar. That requires interest. How often do you see people wearing a JLC? It's not often. And when you do, your assumption as a watch nerd is going to be that this person has an interest in watches. And I don't think that assumption would be incorrect most of the time. In my view, the high information, high interest consumer is a key demographic for JLC. It's a critical demographic. It's one that isn't easily pleased. It speaks to some extent to why JLC don't do better than they do because it's often a hard sell. Small details can kill the interest, and the buyer is going to research a lot more. But when you get it right, then you have a seriously loyal customer. Let's plot some brands into these two axes of information and interest. What are the main target customers for Rolex? The majority, low information, low interest. Again, I'm not knocking the generic Rolex customer. Also, it doesn't imply that they are the only customers. A lot of Rolex owners are enthusiasts and quality orientated, but more, I would argue, are targeted with this low information, low interest perspective. JLC is high info, high interest. Moser, definitely high info and high interest. You can see how each of these brands coexist with their customers. They craft something for their target demographic, and the target demographic in turn responds and shapes the brand's decisions. Zin, a lot of customers, I would argue, are likely high on information and high on interest. But now you're probably thinking, sure, that makes sense. You've got low info, high interest. But are there any examples of the other 2 points of the graph? Yes. Low information, high interest, G-Shock. Super enthusiasts, love watches, love the features, but do they really dive deep into the specs of G-Shock? Not always. There are also tons of other brands in the value space where customers want to understand if they're getting value for money, but they are not watch nerds. This is a function of economics and disposable income, but I would argue that compared to Rolex, the average Tudor buyer wants a little bit more information. They want to understand and be confident that they're buying a good watch. And that's why Tudor talks about metas, because it's much more specific information compared to Rolex's more general communications. I mean, again, even the fact that the vast majority of Tudors are tool watches communicates a lot of information. It's a tool. Tools need to be sturdy. That's more useful. Also consider Christopher Ward. I would make the argument right now that CW have always targeted high information customers. They've focused on value for money. They have focused on their engineering skills, their cost movements, their production practices. They have been massively open and have spoken to people that seek out information and want value for money. And they search for some seeming sort of objective data that supports that these are good watches. CW does not speak to customers that just accept CW as saying we have good watches. As Christopher Ward have grown, 2 distinct customers are now appearing. Both are still high on information scale, but as they become more popular, I think they'll have more high and low interest customers. Christopher Ward has long been a value enthusiast brand, but as they've grown, they're speaking more and more to customers outside of the watch nerd community. And that means that the inherent interest isn't there as much. They need more customers that want a good watch. They still speak to them and address their needs for lots of information about why they're good watches, but they don't necessarily cater entirely to the nerds or the high interest people. Then there's Patek Philippe. Now we know that Thierry Stern has all the best ideas. He recently 100% designed the Cubitus himself without inside or outside help, and he understands his customers better than anyone. He's amazing. He's also square-faced. Okay, that was mean. But I suppose I'm just poor in his eyes, so I'm likely just bitter. Setting that aside, there's an interesting discussion here. Why did Thierry Stern discontinue the Nautilus in steel? Simple. Patek Philippe was starting to get too many customers that were low information, low interest. Rolex has its key strength that a vast majority of their customers just want a good watch. Low information, low interest. But for Patek, that was a disaster because those low interest customers didn't care about chiming complications. That's high interest territory. And those Nautilus chasers, a lot of them were not interested enough in watches or Patek to buy anything else. Now they have the Cubitus. And honestly, based on Thierry's statements in interviews, I don't think a lot of deep thought has gone into the launch of that watch. But in the framework I've described, I think it's aimed at low information, high interest customers. Patek thrives to a large extent on customers that inherently trust the Patek brand, so low information, but are very interested in expanding their watch collection and their Patek watch collection, so high interest. Some of you watching right now who are Patek lovers are going to say, Mike, are you saying I'm low information? How rude of you. And I'm not at all. I think there are high information customers with high interest in Patek. There's no doubt about that. You guys are the ones that have a meltdown when Patek CNCs a gold rotor instead of hand finishing it. You get nervous tics when talking about the stamped dial on the 6007G. You are high information and high interest. But most Patek customers, if it were up to Patek, would be low information and high interest. That's my contention at least. Again, making a dangerous stereotyping assumption, but it's going to be an illustration. Mark Wahlberg. He's clearly a high interest Patek customer. But do we think he's high information? My gut feeling is no. High interest, low information. That's the kind of customers Patek wants. They like complications, but a stamped dial is not going to scare them away or dissuade them in any way. Finally, there's a modifier which I call differentiation, or to use a colloquial term, the sheep factor. Are you trying to be like everybody else and appeal to the masses, or are you trying as a brand to be edgy? Rolex appeals to the masses. Omega, relatively speaking, mainly appeals to the masses. Moser has for the longest time tried to be edgy. Formex, edgy. Zelos, edgy. Oris, kind of edgy. Tudor definitely started by trying to be edgy with their relaunch. I mean, they even say they are born to dare. I call this sheep factor a modifier, and it's because it's a transitory state. Marketing execs talk about first movers and early adopters. It's the same concept I'm working with. When you're on the outside in terms of popularity, you as a manufacturer consider whether you should try to be different. But the moment you become popular, the thing that made you different is now the thing that everybody else is copying. Studio Underdog have had that differentiation factor. They have been edgy. And for me, the moment they did the collab with Moser, they became ever so slightly less edgy because they collaborated with a historically more established brand. Paradoxically, Moser, on the other hand, became more edgy by opening their doors to a small, affordable player. As you as a brand become more mainstream, you inevitably lose some of your customers because the edgy customer is the one that chose the watch that no one else has. This person can be high information or low interest or high interest, but they will shy away from what everyone else is doing or buying. As a brand, you have to ask yourself, are you aiming for the mainstream buyer? That's what Bremont have done. They relaunched and said, we're not going to be edgy. We're just going to make a good watch and compete with everybody else on the same terms. Studio Underdog said, we want to be different. It's not a given that any brand always starts out as edgy. You can do either. All this influences how it informs companies' business decisions. Not all brands use this little model I've described about information, interest, and differentiation, but it's useful to me for a couple of reasons. To me, it explains why Patek killed the Nautilus in steel. Low information, low interest customers are the bread and butter of Rolex. This is why they don't innovate. Not because they don't need to, but because change would challenge the dominant understanding that Rolex watches are good. Low information, low interest wants stability and consistency. So that's what Rolex does. These dimensions, whether the brands are aware of it or not, are informing their decisions regarding designs and products. What does it say about us as enthusiasts? For me, it explains why enthusiasts get so frustrated with Rolex, because there's relatively little that caters to the high interest, high information enthusiasts. That customer is loyal to Rolex despite not receiving any love. And for those people that through their high information propensity for researching facts come to the conclusion that Rolex is overpriced, they can't reconcile that with the fact that so many people are still happy to buy Rolex. We want Rolex to come up with something interesting, but they don't, because that's not what their primary customers want. To me, it also explains why price increases irk enthusiasts more. They annoy us because many of us are inherently high information. So we are not only aware, but unaccepting of the fact that something got more expensive without something becoming better in any meaningful way. Why do some of us get annoyed with the Studio Underdog collaboration with Moser? Part of it's price, but more importantly, it ignores those differentiator customers that were loyal from the beginning and signals that they want to go for the mass market to become more broadly appealing and more desirable. Often, business decisions illustrate how we see ourselves versus what the company does. A big Pilot 43 speaks to a low information customer. The real customer knows that a real big Pilot is at a minimum of 45 millimeters. A high information customer wants a Luminor to be able to dive to 300 meters. A Luminor Due with splash resistance is an affront, but for a low information client, a Luminor looks cool, it's well made, and it's a quality watch. Again, I have to say, low information does not mean undiscerning or unsophisticated. It just means when it comes to this specific product, these customers don't feel the need to dive into the details to feel comfortable that they are getting a decent watch. For me, it also illustrates the challenge of the brands that try to do what Rolex does. There are in reality not a lot of low information, low interest brands out there. Rolex is one of them. Sure, if you want to diss a brand and their customers, I'm sure there'll be people in the comments that will state that their brand's customers are low info and low interest. But the point is, I can see how JLC would love for their customers to be low information and low interest. We just need to convince people that we're great. Just buy us. The desire is understandable, but the reality is that the nature of complex watches like duometers and skeletonized reverso chronographs does not match well with that kind of customer. They are high information and high interest. And when you live up to their expectations, they are incredibly loyal. I think brands sometimes forget that. If your conclusion was all Rolex buyers are low information and low interest, then you're missing the point. Neither of those things mean Rolex are bad watches. They just mean that Rolex watches, as an example, are so good that people that don't have a massive interest in watches can feel safe in the belief that they're getting a pretty good watch, which is in a price range that they are perfectly fine with paying. Are you, as a high interest, high information person, frustrated with Patek stamped dials? Absolutely, but right now, you're not their main customer. But you do have power, because what you say about Patek's watches does impact the low information buyers over time. Patek would do well to listen to your critiques. Not that Chery needs your feedback, of course. The point of all this is that in this market where brands are definitely segmenting you and making assumptions about your buying behavior, you have to remember that you can't apply the generic assumptions to specific individuals. I do believe it's entirely accurate that a lot of Rolex buyers exhibit this low information, low interest characteristic. But then there's me. I'm medium information, high interest, medium differentiation. I'll go mainstream sometimes, and every now and again I'll refuse to jump on the bandwagon of the moon swatch, and I'll seek out something else simply because everybody else is doing it. As someone wrote in the comments at some point, they said I'm a contrarian, and to some extent I am. Whenever someone says Rolex buyers are sheep, my gut reaction is to want to buy a Rolex simply to annoy these people. Whenever someone says yet you have to get a Studio Underdog, I also feel no, you don't tell me what to buy. And then I bought a Pelagos FXD from Tudor because I felt it looked nice on my wrist, even though Tudor is super hyped. That's all it was. I liked it. Why did you buy your most recent watch? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.